Margaret O'Sullivan held tight to her small bag as the stagecoach came to a stop. The wheels made a loud noise on the dirt road. Dust flew everywhere. She had been sitting in this bumpy coach for 3 long days. Her back hurt and her dress was dirty from the trip. She looked out the small window. This was Millbrook, Colorado. This was her new home. The town was much smaller than Boston. She could see the whole place from where she sat. There was one main street with wooden buildings on both sides. Some of the buildings looked old and worn. The paint was coming off many of them. Margaret took a deep breath. She was scared but also excited. In her bag, she had 15 letters from Thomas Brennan. She had read each letter so many times that she knew them by heart. Thomas had put an ad in the Boston newspaper. He was looking for a wife. Margaret had answered his ad 6 months ago. At first, she thought it was a crazy idea. She had never met this man. He lived far away in a place she had never seen. But Margaret had few choices. Her parents had died 2 years ago. She had no brothers or sisters. She worked in a factory in Boston, but the pay was very small. She could barely buy food and pay for her tiny room. When she saw Thomas's ad, something inside her said to write to him. His first letter was kind and honest. He told her about his life in Colorado. He had a small farm and worked in the mines sometimes. He was 32 years old and had never been married. He wanted a family. He wanted someone to share his life with. Margaret was 26. Most women her age were already married with children. She had given up hope of finding a husband in Boston. The men there wanted women with money or family connections. Margaret had neither. Thomas wrote to her every 2 weeks. His letters were always gentle and respectful. He told her about the mountains and the clean air. He told her about his small house and his vegetable garden. He promised to take care of her. He promised to be a good husband. In her letters to Thomas, Margaret told him about her life too. She told him about working in the factory. She told him about her parents and how much she missed them. She told him about her dreams of having a real home and a family. As the months passed, Margaret began to feel like she knew Thomas. His letters made her smile. He seemed like a good man. When he asked her to come to Colorado to marry him, she said yes. It took her 2 months to save enough money for the trip. Now she was here. Margaret looked down at her best dress. It was blue cotton with small white flowers. She had made it herself. It was the dress she planned to wear when she met Thomas for the first time. She wanted to look nice for him. The coach driver opened the door. "End of the line, miss," he said. He was an older man with a gray beard. "You sure someone is meeting you here?" "Yes," Margaret said. My husband-to-be said he would meet me here." The driver helped her down from the coach. Her legs felt shaky after sitting for so long. He handed her the small trunk that held all her things. It was not very heavy. Margaret did not own much. Margaret looked around the street. There were a few people walking about. Some men were loading supplies onto a wagon. 2 women in long dresses talked outside a store. Children played in the dirt near the buildings. She did not see Thomas anywhere. In his last letter, he had told her exactly when the coach would arrive. He had promised to be waiting for her. Margaret felt a little worried, but she told herself he was probably just running late. She stood by her trunk and waited. The coach driver tipped his hat to her and drove away. The coach disappeared down the road, leaving a cloud of dust behind it. Margaret felt very alone all of a sudden. More time passed. Margaret began to feel really worried now. Where was Thomas? Had something happened to him? Maybe he had changed his mind about marrying her. Maybe he had seen her get off the coach and decided she was not pretty enough. Margaret tried not to think such thoughts, but they kept coming. She had used almost all her money to come here. She had quit her job at the factory. She had given up her room in Boston. If Thomas did not want her, she had nowhere to go. An older man walked toward her. He wore a badge on his shirt. Margaret could see that he was the sheriff. He had kind eyes, but his face looked very serious. Margaret's heart began to beat faster. "Miss O'Sullivan?" the sheriff asked. "Yes, that's me," Margaret said. Her voice sounded small and scared. "I'm Sheriff Coleman," he said. He took off his hat and held it in his hands. "I'm afraid I have some very bad news for you." Margaret felt her legs get weak. She knew something terrible had happened. "Is it Thomas?" she asked. The sheriff nodded slowly. "Yes, miss. I'm very sorry to tell you this. Thomas Brennan died 3 weeks ago." The words hit Margaret like a punch in the stomach. She could not breathe for a moment. "Died?" she whispered. There was an accident at the mine, Sheriff Coleman said. It happened very fast. He didn't suffer. Margaret stared at the sheriff. She could not believe what she was hearing. Thomas was dead. The man she had come so far to marry was dead. She felt dizzy and thought she might fall down. But his letters, she said. He wrote to me just last month. That was before the accident, the sheriff said gently. I'm real sorry, miss. Thomas was a good man. Everyone in town liked him. Margaret did not know what to say. She had dreamed about this day for months. She had imagined meeting Thomas and seeing him smile. She had imagined their wedding and their life together. Now all those dreams were gone. What am I supposed to do now? Margaret asked. Tears began to run down her face. Sheriff Coleman looked very sad for her. I don't rightly know, miss. Do you have family back east? Someone who could send you money for the trip home? Margaret shook her head. No, there's no one. The sheriff was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Well, we'll figure something out. Mrs. Henderson runs the boarding house. Maybe she can give you a room for a few days while we sort this out. Margaret nodded, but she felt lost and scared. She was alone in a strange place with almost no money. The man she had come to marry was dead. She did not know how she would survive. But Margaret was stronger than she knew. She had survived losing her parents. She had survived working in the hard factory job. She would find a way to survive this too. She had to. Sheriff Coleman picked up Margaret's trunk. It was clear he felt bad for her. Come on, miss, he said. Let me take you to Mrs. Henderson's place. It's just down the street. Margaret followed him, still feeling like she was in a bad dream. Her legs moved, but her mind could not accept what was happening. 3 weeks ago, Thomas had been alive. While she was packing her things and saying goodbye to her life in Boston, he was already dead. They walked past a few stores and stopped in front of a 2-story wooden building. A sign outside said Henderson's boarding house. The sheriff knocked on the door. A woman in her 50s opened the door. She had gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her dress was plain but clean. When she saw Margaret's tear-stained face, her expression became soft and kind. Mrs. Henderson, this is Miss O'Sullivan, the sheriff said. She's the young lady who came to marry Thomas Brennan. Mrs. Henderson's hand went to her heart. Oh, my dear child, she said. Come in right now. The inside of the boarding house was simple but clean. There were wooden chairs in the front room and lace curtains on the windows. It smelled like bread and soap. Mrs. Henderson led Margaret to a chair and brought her a cup of water. Sheriff Coleman told me about Thomas, Mrs. Henderson said. I am so very sorry for your loss. Margaret drank the water but could barely taste it. I don't understand, she said. His last letter said he was excited to meet me. He was making plans for our wedding. Sheriff Coleman sat down across from her. That letter was probably written before the accident happened, he said. The mail doesn't come and go very fast out here. Tell me what happened, Margaret said. She needed to know, even though it would hurt to hear it. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. Thomas worked his own small mine claim about 2 miles outside of town. He went there most days to dig and look for gold or silver. 3 weeks ago, he didn't come home when he usually did. Some of the other miners went looking for him. Sheriff Coleman paused and looked down at his hands. They found him inside the mine. There had been a cave-in. Some of the rocks fell and, well, it killed him right away. Margaret closed her eyes. Poor Thomas. He had died alone in that dark mine. Did he find anything? Any gold or silver? Not much, the sheriff said. Thomas wasn't a lucky miner, but he worked hard at it. He was trying to make enough money to support a wife and family. Mrs. Henderson brought Margaret a piece of bread and some cheese. You need to eat something, dear. You look ready to fall over. Margaret tried to eat, but the food felt like sand in her mouth. Where is Thomas buried? She asked. In the town cemetery up on the hill, Sheriff Coleman said. We gave him a proper burial. Pastor Williams said nice words about him. Margaret felt fresh tears coming. She had never even met Thomas, but she felt like she had lost someone important. His letters had given her hope for the future. Now that hope was gone. I know this is a lot to take in, Mrs. Henderson said. But we need to talk about what you're going to do now. Margaret wiped her eyes. I don't know. I used almost all my money to come here. I have maybe $3 left. Sheriff Coleman frowned. That's not enough to get you back to Boston. Even if I had the money, I have nothing to go back to, Margaret said. I quit my job. I gave up my room.
I have no family there. Mrs. Henderson and the sheriff looked at each other.
Margaret could see they felt sorry for her, but she also knew they had their own problems to worry about. "I don't like to ask this," Mrs. Henderson said carefully. "But can you work? I mean, are you able to do jobs like cooking or cleaning?" "Yes," Margaret said quickly. "I worked in a factory, but I also know how to cook and clean and sew. I can do any kind of work." "Well," Mrs. Henderson said, "I could use some help here at the boarding house. I can't pay much, but I could give you a small room and meals in exchange for work." It wasn't much, but it was something. Margaret felt grateful. "Thank you. I'll work very hard, I promise." Sheriff Coleman stood up. "I'll let you ladies talk about the details. Miss O'Sullivan, if you need anything, you know where to find me." After the sheriff left, Mrs. Henderson showed Margaret to a tiny room on the second floor. It had a small bed, a chair, and a window that looked out at the mountains. It was much smaller than her room in Boston, but it was clean. "The work isn't easy," Mrs. Henderson explained. "I have 6 men who live here full-time. They're miners and ranch hands. They need 3 meals a day and clean sheets once a week. There's also washing and cleaning to do." "I can do all of that," Margaret said. Mrs. Henderson studied her face. "You seem like a nice girl. But I have to ask, are you sure you want to stay here? This is a rough town. Life here is hard, especially for a woman alone." Margaret looked out the small window. She could see the mountains in the distance. They were beautiful, but also looked cold and dangerous. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said honestly. That evening, Margaret sat on her bed and read Thomas's letters again. In one letter, he had written about his dreams for their future. He wanted to build a bigger house. He wanted to plant fruit trees. He wanted children to fill the house with laughter. Now none of that would happen. Margaret felt angry and sad at the same time. Why did bad things always happen to her? First her parents died, and now this. But as she read more of Thomas's letters, she began to feel something else. Thomas had been kind and hopeful, even though his life was hard too. He had worked in dangerous mines and lived alone, but he still believed good things could happen. Margaret folded the letters carefully and put them away. She would keep them always. They were all she had left of the man who had wanted to marry her. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson woke her early. "Time to start earning your keep," she said, but she said it with a smile. Margaret spent her first day learning how to cook for hungry men who worked hard jobs. She learned how to make coffee strong enough to wake the dead. She learned how to wash clothes in big tubs and hang them to dry in the mountain air. The work was harder than her factory job, but somehow it felt better. At the factory, she had been just one of many workers doing the same thing over and over. Here, she was needed. Mrs. Henderson depended on her. The men who lived at the boarding house were mostly polite to her. They said please and thank you when she served their meals. A few of them had known Thomas and told her he was a good man. "Thomas talked about you," said one older miner named Pete. "He was real excited about getting married. He bought new shirts and everything." This made Margaret feel both happy and sad. Thomas had really cared about her, even though they had never met. As the days passed, Margaret began to understand why Thomas had needed to advertise for a wife. There were very few women in Millbrook. Most of the men were lonely, just like Thomas had been. But Margaret was not ready to think about finding another husband. She was still grieving for Thomas and the life they might have had together. For now, she just wanted to work hard and figure out how to build a life in this strange new place. 2 weeks had passed since Margaret arrived in Millbrook. She had settled into a routine at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, but the work was harder than anything she had ever done before. Every morning, Margaret woke up before the sun came up. She had to start the fire in the big kitchen stove and make coffee for the 6 men who lived there. Then she cooked breakfast, usually eggs, bacon, and biscuits. The men ate a lot because they worked hard jobs all day. After breakfast, Margaret cleaned the kitchen and started on the laundry. She had to wash sheets, towels, and the men's work clothes by hand in big metal tubs. The soap was rough and made her hands red and sore. Then she hung everything outside to dry. In the afternoon, she prepared lunch and dinner. She swept floors, made beds, and cleaned the bathroom. By the time she went to bed each night, her whole body ached. Mrs. Henderson was kind but strict. She showed Margaret how to do everything the right way. "These men work dangerous jobs," she explained. "When they come home, they want good food and a clean place to rest. If we don't take care of them properly, they'll go somewhere else." Margaret understood. The boarding house was Mrs. Henderson's only way to make money. If she lost her boarders, she would lose her home too. The hardest part for Margaret was how lonely she felt. The men were polite to her, but they were much older, and had nothing in common with her. Mrs. Henderson was busy running the business and didn't have time for long conversations. At night, Margaret would sit in her small room and read Thomas's letters again. She tried to imagine what her life would have been like if he had lived. Would they have been happy together? Would she have learned to love him? Sometimes she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake coming to Colorado. In Boston, her life had been hard, but at least she knew what to expect each day. Here, everything was strange and difficult. The town of Millbrook was very different from Boston. There were no big buildings or busy streets. There were no theaters or libraries. The closest thing to entertainment was the saloon, and Margaret would never go into a place like that. The weather was different too. Even though it was summer, the nights were cold because they were so high up in the mountains. Margaret had to wear a coat in the evening, something she never did in Boston during summer. But the worst part was feeling like she didn't belong anywhere. She wasn't married, so she wasn't really part of the community. She wasn't a real resident of the town, but she also couldn't go back to where she came from. One day, Margaret was hanging laundry when she heard two women talking nearby. They didn't know she could hear them. "That's the girl who came to marry Thomas Brennan," one woman said. "Poor thing," said the other. "What's she going to do now? A woman alone out here doesn't have many choices." "I heard she's working for Mrs. Henderson," the first woman said. "But that won't last forever. Mrs. Henderson can barely afford to feed herself." Margaret felt her cheeks get hot. She knew the women were not trying to be mean. But their words hurt anyway. They were right, though. Working at the boarding house was only a temporary solution. That evening, Margaret asked Mrs. Henderson if they could talk privately. "I heard some women talking today," Margaret said. "They said you can't afford to keep me working here much longer." Mrs. Henderson sighed and sat down heavily in her chair. "I wasn't going to say anything yet, but business has been slow lately. Some of the mines are closing down. When that happens, the miners leave town to find work somewhere else." Margaret felt scared. "How long can you keep me?" "Maybe another month," Mrs. Henderson said. "I'm sorry, dear. I wish I could do more," Margaret nodded. She appreciated Mrs. Henderson's honesty. "Are there any other jobs in town?" "Not many for a woman," Mrs. Henderson said. "There's the restaurant, but they can barely afford to pay the cook they have now. Some of the ranch wives need help sometimes, but those jobs don't last long." That night, Margaret lay in bed thinking about her future. She had saved a little money from her work at the boarding house, but not much. Mrs. Henderson could only afford to pay her 50 cents a week plus room and board. Margaret thought about Thomas's letters again. He had written about his mine and his small farm. What had happened to those things when he died? Did someone else own them now? The next day, Margaret decided to ask Sheriff Coleman about Thomas's property. She found him at his office, a small building next to the jail. "Miss O'Sullivan," he said when she walked in. "How are you getting along?" "I'm managing," Margaret said. "But I wanted to ask you something. What happened to Thomas's mine and his house after he died?" Sheriff Coleman scratched his head. "Well, I reckon they're just sitting there empty. Thomas didn't have any family that we know of. I suppose legally they belong to the territory now." "Could someone else claim them?" Margaret asked. "I suppose so if they filed the right papers," the sheriff said. "Why do you ask?" Margaret wasn't sure why she was asking. She certainly couldn't work a mine by herself. But something about the idea of Thomas's property just sitting empty bothered her. "I was just curious," she said. On her way back to the boarding house, Margaret decided to walk past Thomas's house. She had never seen it before. The sheriff had told her it was about a mile outside of town near the creek. Margaret found the small wooden house easily enough. It was simple but well built. There was a vegetable garden behind it, but the plants were dying from lack of water. Thomas's horse was gone. The sheriff had probably sold it to pay for the burial. Margaret walked around the property and tried to imagine Thomas living there alone. The house felt sad and empty. She could see through the windows that there were still furniture and belongings inside. As she was about to leave, Margaret noticed something that made her stop. There were recent footprints in the dirt around the house. Someone had been here lately, and it wasn't the sheriff. Margaret felt a chill run down her back. Who would be visiting Thomas's empty house and why? She hurried back to town, but she couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. Something didn't feel right, but she couldn't figure out what it was. That evening, one of the boarders mentioned something that made Margaret pay attention. "Heard someone's been asking questions about Thomas Brennan's mine," said Pete, the older miner. Some fancy men from Denver were in the saloon yesterday. What kind of questions? Asked another man. Wanted to know exactly where his claim was located, Pete said, and whether he had any family who might inherit it. Margaret stopped wiping the table and listened more carefully. That's strange, said the other man. Thomas never found much in that mine. Why would anyone from Denver care about it? Pete shrugged. Maybe they know something we don't. Or maybe they're just buying up all the old claims, hoping one of them will pay off. After the men went to bed, Margaret sat in the kitchen thinking about what she had heard. First the footprints at Thomas's house, and now strangers asking questions about his mine. It all seemed very suspicious. Margaret made a decision. Tomorrow, she would visit Thomas's grave and then go look at his mine. She wanted to see for herself what was so interesting about it. She didn't know it yet, but this decision would change everything. The next morning, Margaret told Mrs. Henderson she needed a few hours to visit Thomas's grave. Mrs. Henderson gave her permission, understanding that Margaret needed to say a proper goodbye. The cemetery was on a hill overlooking the town. Margaret found Thomas's grave easily. It was marked with a simple wooden cross that had his name and dates carved into it. Someone had placed wildflowers on the grave recently. Margaret knelt down beside the grave and spoke quietly to Thomas. "I'm sorry I never got to meet you," she said. "Your letters made me think you were a good man. I wish things had been different." She sat there for a while, thinking about the life they might have had together. Then she decided to walk to Thomas's mine. She wanted to see the place where he had died. Margaret followed the directions Pete had given her. The mine was about 2 miles from town up a rocky path that followed the creek. It was hard walking, and Margaret had to stop several times to rest. When she finally reached the mine, she was surprised by what she saw. The entrance was boarded up with new wooden planks. There was a sign that said, "Danger, keep out." But what really surprised her were the horse tracks in the dirt. Fresh horse tracks. Margaret looked around carefully. She could see where someone had been digging near the mine entrance. There were also empty food cans and the remains of a campfire. Someone had been staying here recently. As Margaret was examining the area, she heard the sound of horses coming up the trail. She quickly hid behind some rocks and watched as 2 men on horseback approached the mine. The men were well dressed, not like the rough miners and cowboys Margaret was used to seeing. They wore clean suits and fancy hats. One man was tall and thin with a gray beard. The other was younger and heavier. "This is definitely the right place," the older man said as he got off his horse. "Brennan's claim marker is right there." "Are you sure he didn't tell anyone about what he found?" the younger man asked. "We made sure he couldn't tell anyone anything," the older man said in a cold voice. Margaret felt her blood turn to ice. What did he mean by that? It sounded like these men had something to do with Thomas's death. "The sheriff still thinks it was a mining accident," the older man continued. "As long as nobody asks too many questions, we're safe." "What about that woman who came to marry him?" the younger man asked. "She's just a mail-order bride with no money and no family," the older man said. "She can't cause us any trouble. Besides, she doesn't know anything." Margaret pressed herself closer to the rocks, trying not to make any noise. These men were talking about Thomas's death like they had caused it. But why? What had Thomas found in his mine that was worth killing for? "How much longer do we have to wait?" the younger man asked. "Just until the paperwork goes through," the older man said. "Once the territory officially declares the claim abandoned, we can file our own claim. Then all that silver will be ours." Silver! Thomas had found silver in his mine. That's why these men had killed him. Margaret felt sick to her stomach. Thomas had died because of greed. The men looked around the mine for a few more minutes, then got back on their horses and rode away. Margaret waited until she was sure they were gone before coming out from behind the rocks. She walked over to the mine entrance and looked at the boards that covered it. Through the gaps, she could see that the mine went deep into the hillside. Thomas had been working alone in there when he died. Or when he was killed. Margaret felt angry and sad at the same time. Thomas had been a good man who just wanted to make enough money to support a family. These evil men had killed him for silver. But what could she do about it? She was just a woman with no money and no power. Who would believe her story? And even if they did believe her, how could she prove what she had heard? Margaret started walking back to town, her mind spinning with questions. She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice the lone rider coming toward her on the trail. The man was tall and dark-haired, riding a black horse. He was dusty from travel and looked tired. As he got closer, Margaret could see that he had green eyes and strong features. Something about his face looked familiar. The man stopped his horse when he saw Margaret. "Excuse me, miss," he said. His voice was deep and rough. "Can you tell me how to get to the town of Millbrook?" "You're almost there," Margaret said, pointing down the trail. "Just follow this path for about 2 miles." The man studied her face. "You're not from around here, are you? You don't look like a local." Margaret wasn't sure how to answer. She didn't want to tell a stranger her whole story. "I live in town now," she said simply. The man nodded. "I'm looking for information about someone who used to live here. A man named Thomas Brennan. Did you know him?" Margaret's heart started beating faster. "Why are you asking about Thomas?" The man's expression became sad and serious. "Thomas was my brother. I just heard that he died. I came as soon as I could." Margaret stared at the man in shock. This was Thomas's brother. He looked like Thomas might have looked, based on the description in his letters. But Thomas had never mentioned having a brother. "You're Thomas's brother?" Margaret asked. "Yes, I'm Daniel Brennan," the man said. "And you are?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, then decided to tell him the truth. "I'm Margaret O'Sullivan. I came here to marry Thomas, but he was already dead when I arrived." Daniel's eyes widened in surprise. "You're the mail-order bride? Thomas wrote to me about you months ago." "He wrote to you?" Margaret asked. "But Sheriff Coleman said Thomas didn't have any family." Daniel's face became hard and bitter. "Thomas and I hadn't spoken in 5 years. We had a falling out over some family business. I've been working cattle drives in Texas. I only got word about his death a few weeks ago." Margaret could see pain in Daniel's eyes. He was grieving for his brother just like she was grieving for the future she had lost. "I'm sorry for your loss," Margaret said softly. "I'm sorry for yours too," Daniel replied. "Thomas was excited about marrying you. He thought you might be the one to help him settle down and be happy." They stood there for a moment, two strangers united by their connection to Thomas. "Can you tell me what happened to him?" Daniel asked. "The message I got just said there was a mining accident." Margaret looked up at Daniel and made a decision. She had to tell someone what she had overheard at the mine. Maybe Daniel would know what to do. "I don't think it was an accident," Margaret said quietly. "I think Thomas was murdered." Daniel's whole body went rigid. "What do you mean?" Margaret told Daniel everything she had heard the two men saying at the mine. She told him about the silver and how they were waiting to claim Thomas's mine for themselves. When she finished, Daniel was quiet for a long time. His hands were clenched into fists and his jaw was tight with anger. "Those men killed my brother for silver," Daniel said finally. His voice was low and dangerous. "And they think they're going to get away with it. What can we do?" Margaret asked. "Who would believe us?" Daniel looked down at her with his green eyes, and Margaret could see that he was a man who knew how to fight for what was right. "We're going to find proof," Daniel said, "and then we're going to make sure those men pay for what they did to Thomas." Daniel and Margaret walked back to town together, leading Daniel's horse. Margaret told him more details about what she had seen and heard at the mine. Daniel listened carefully to every word. "These men you saw," Daniel said. "Can you describe them again?" Margaret thought back to the two strangers. One was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and a beard. He was thin and wore an expensive-looking black suit. The other was younger and heavier with brown hair. Daniel nodded grimly. "I've seen men like that before. They work for big mining companies, buying up claims and pushing out small miners." When they reached Millbrook, Daniel caused quite a stir. People came out of buildings to stare at the stranger who looked so much like Thomas. Word spread quickly that Thomas's brother had come to town. Sheriff Coleman was one of the first to greet Daniel. "Mr. Brennan," he said, tipping his hat. "I'm sorry for your loss. Thomas was a good man." "Thank you, Sheriff," Daniel said. "I'd like to ask you some questions about my brother's death if you have time." "Of course," Sheriff Coleman said. "Come to my office." Margaret started to leave, but Daniel stopped her. "Miss O'Sullivan should come too. She was supposed to be Thomas's wife. She has a right to know what happened." The three of them went to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Coleman told Daniel the same story he had told Margaret, that Thomas had died in a cave-in at his mine. "Did you examine the mine after the accident?" Daniel asked. "Well, yes," Sheriff Coleman said, "but there wasn't much to see. The roof had collapsed and Thomas was buried under the rocks." "Who found him?" Daniel asked. "Two other miners, Pete Wilson and Jake Murphy. They got worried when Thomas didn't come back to town for 2 days. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Sheriff, can I ask you something man to man?" "Sure," Sheriff Coleman said. "Did anything about Thomas's death seem strange to you? Anything that didn't make sense?" Sheriff Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, I have to admit, Thomas was always very careful in the mine. He knew about safety. It was unusual for him to have an accident like that." "But you still think it was an accident?" Daniel pressed. "I have no proof that it was anything else," Sheriff Coleman said, but Margaret could tell he had doubts. After they left the sheriff's office, Daniel was quiet and thoughtful. Margaret could see that he was planning something. "I want to see Thomas's house," Daniel said finally. Margaret led him to the small house by the creek. Daniel walked around the property slowly, looking at everything carefully. When he saw the vegetable garden, his face became sad. "Thomas always loved to grow things," Daniel said quietly. "Even when we were kids, he was always planting seeds and taking care of plants." Daniel tried the front door of the house. It was unlocked. They went inside together. The house was simple but comfortable. There was a main room with a kitchen area and a bedroom in the back. Thomas's clothes still hung on hooks by the door. His dishes were still on the shelf. "It feels like he just stepped out for a minute," Margaret said softly. Daniel walked around the house, touching things that had belonged to his brother. He picked up a book from the table and opened it. "Thomas loved to read," he said, "especially books about farming and mining." Margaret watched Daniel and could see how much he was hurting. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Why hadn't you and Thomas talked in 5 years?" Daniel's face became hard again. "We had a fight about our father's land. When our parents died, Thomas wanted to sell the farm and come west to look for gold. I thought it was a foolish dream. I wanted to keep the farm and live a safe, quiet life." "What happened?" Margaret asked. "We both said things we shouldn't have said," Daniel replied. "I called Thomas a dreamer and a fool. He said I was afraid to take any risks in life. We were both right in a way." Daniel sat down heavily in one of Thomas's chairs. "I've regretted that fight every day for 5 years. I kept meaning to write to him, but I was too proud. Now it's too late." Margaret felt sorry for Daniel. She could see how much he blamed himself for not making peace with his brother before Thomas died. "Thomas wrote about you sometimes," Margaret said gently. "In his letters to me. He missed you." Daniel looked up at her with surprise. "He did?" "Yes, he said he had a brother who was very strong and brave, but also very stubborn. He hoped that someday you two would be friends again." Tears came to Daniel's eyes. "I wasted so much time being angry," he said. Margaret sat down across from him. "You're here now. You can still do right by Thomas by finding out the truth about what happened to him." Daniel wiped his eyes and nodded. "You're right. Let's search the house. Maybe Thomas left some clues about what he found in his mine." They spent the next hour going through Thomas's belongings. They found his mining tools and some rock samples, but nothing that seemed important. Then Daniel found something interesting in the bedroom. "Look at this," Daniel said. He had found a loose floorboard under Thomas's bed. When he lifted it up, there was a small space underneath. Inside the space was a metal box. Daniel pulled it out and opened it. Inside were some papers, a small leather bag, and a letter addressed to Miss Margaret O'Sullivan. Margaret's heart jumped when she saw her name. "That's for me," she said. Daniel handed her the letter. With shaking hands, Margaret opened it and read, "My dear Margaret, if you are reading this, then something has happened to me. I hope I am wrong, but I think I may be in danger. I have found something valuable in my mine, and some bad men want to take it from me. I have tried to be careful, but they are watching me. If anything happens to me, please know that I was very excited to meet you and marry you. I have left some papers in this box that might be important. Give them to someone you trust. I hope you will be safe and happy. With love, Thomas." Margaret finished reading and looked up at Daniel with tears in her eyes. "He knew he was in danger," she whispered. Daniel's face was dark with anger. "Those men threatened him, and then they killed him when he wouldn't give up his claim." Margaret looked in the box and found the papers Thomas had mentioned. There were official mining documents, maps of his claim, and something else that made her gasp. "Daniel, look at this," she said. She held up a piece of paper that looked like a business letter. Daniel read it and his eyes widened. The letter was from a big mining company in Denver. They were offering to buy Thomas's claim for a very large amount of money, much more than a small mine should be worth. "This proves Thomas found something valuable," Daniel said. Something worth killing for. Margaret found one more thing in the box, the small leather bag. She opened it and poured the contents into her palm. It was pieces of rock that sparkled with veins of silver. This must be samples from his mine, Margaret said. Look how much silver is in these rocks. Daniel held up one of the rock samples to the light. This is very rich ore, he said. A mine full of rock like this would be worth thousands of dollars. They sat in silence for a moment, understanding the full truth. Thomas had discovered a valuable silver mine. The mining company had tried to buy it from him cheaply. When he refused, they had him killed so they could claim the mine for themselves. We have to take this evidence to the sheriff, Margaret said. Daniel shook his head. Not yet. Sheriff Coleman is a good man, but he's just a small-town sheriff. These mining companies have lawyers and money and influence. We need more proof before we accuse them of murder. What kind of proof? Margaret asked. Daniel was quiet for a long time, thinking. Finally, he said, We need to catch them in the act. We need to make them admit what they did. Margaret felt scared. That sounds dangerous. It is dangerous, Daniel agreed. But it's the only way to get justice for Thomas. Are you willing to help me? Margaret thought about Thomas and his kind letters. She thought about how excited he had been to meet her and start a new life together. These evil men had stolen that future from both of them. Yes, Margaret said firmly. I'll help you. Thomas deserves justice. Daniel decided to stay at the boarding house so he could be close to Margaret while they planned their next move. Mrs. Henderson was happy to have another paying customer, even though she was curious about the resemblance between Daniel and Thomas. That evening, Daniel and Margaret sat in the boarding house kitchen after the other men had gone to bed. They spread Thomas's papers on the table and studied them carefully. Look at this, Daniel said, pointing to one of the documents. This is a letter from the Rocky Mountain Mining Company in Denver. They first contacted Thomas 6 months ago. Margaret read the letter. They're offering him $500 for his claim. That seems like a lot of money. It is a lot of money for most mining claims, Daniel said. But look at this second letter dated 2 months later. The second letter offered Thomas $800. A third letter, written just 1 month before Thomas died, offered him $1,000. They kept raising their offer, Margaret said. That means Thomas kept saying no. And that means they knew his mine was worth much more than they were offering, Daniel said. They were trying to cheat him. Margaret found another paper that made her frown. What's this one? Daniel looked at the document. It was written in legal language that was hard to understand, but the meaning was clear. It's a threat, Daniel said grimly. They're telling Thomas that if he doesn't sell, they'll find other ways to get his claim. Margaret felt a chill. Other ways like killing him? That's what it sounds like, Daniel said. They continued looking through the papers. Margaret found a map that Thomas had drawn of his mine. It showed the tunnels he had dug and marked the places where he had found the richest silver ore. Thomas was very organized, Margaret said. He kept careful records of everything. Daniel smiled sadly. He was always like that, even as a boy. He would write down everything. What crops he planted, how much rain fell, what animals he saw. Our father used to tease him about it. As they studied the map, Daniel noticed something strange. Look at this, he said, pointing to a mark on the map. Thomas drew a circle here and wrote special place next to it. What do you think that means? Margaret asked. I don't know, Daniel said, but it's not in the main mine tunnel. It looks like it's in a separate area. Margaret looked more closely at the map. It looks like it might be under his house. Daniel's eyes widened. You might be right. Maybe Thomas hid something under the house. They decided to go back to Thomas's house the next morning to investigate. Margaret was nervous about going back there, but she knew they needed to find out what Thomas had hidden. The next day, Daniel and Margaret rode out to Thomas's house together. Daniel had borrowed a horse from the stable in town. They brought shovels and lanterns in case they needed to dig. When they arrived at the house, Daniel studied Thomas's map again. According to this, the special place should be under the back corner of the house. They went behind the house and looked at the ground. It looked normal, but when Daniel scraped away some dirt with his boot, they could see that the earth had been disturbed recently. Someone has been digging here, Daniel said, but not very deep. They began to dig carefully. After about an hour, Margaret's shovel hit something hard. There's something here, she said excitedly. Daniel helped her clear away the dirt. They found a wooden box, much larger than the one they had found under the floorboard. This box was heavy and locked with a small padlock. Should we break it open? Margaret asked. Daniel shook his head. Let's take it inside first. I don't want anyone to see us out here. They carried the box into Thomas's house and set it on the kitchen table. Daniel used a hammer to break the lock. When they opened the box, both of them gasped. The box was full of silver ore samples, but these were much richer than the ones they had found the day before. There were also several small bags of silver dust and even some silver nuggets that Thomas had refined himself. My God, Daniel whispered. This must be worth thousands of dollars, but that wasn't all. At the bottom of the box, they found more papers. These documents were even more shocking than the ones they had found before. Margaret picked up a letter that was written in Thomas's handwriting. Daniel, you need to read this, she said. The letter was addressed to Margaret. It was dated just 1 week before Thomas died. My dearest Margaret, the letter began, I am writing this because I fear for my life. The men from the mining company have been to see me 3 times now. They are no longer polite. They have threatened to hurt me if I don't sell them my claim. I have decided to hide my most valuable silver samples where they cannot find them. If something happens to me, I want you to have this silver. You can use it to start a new life somewhere safe. I have also written a detailed account of everything that has happened, including the threats these men have made. I hope this information will help bring them to justice if they hurt me. I wish I could have met you and married you properly. You seem like a wonderful woman from your letters. Please be safe and be happy. All my love, Thomas. Margaret's hands were shaking as she finished reading. He wrote this just for me, she said softly. Daniel's face was hard with anger. He knew they were going to kill him, and he still tried to protect you. Margaret found the detailed account that Thomas had mentioned. It was several pages long and described every meeting he had with the men from the mining company. Thomas had written down their names, the dates they came to see him, and exactly what they said. This is evidence, Daniel said. Real evidence that could put these men in prison. But the most shocking discovery was at the very bottom of the box. There was an official document with a government seal on it. Daniel read it carefully and his face went pale. Margaret, he said slowly, this changes everything. What is it? Margaret asked. It's a marriage certificate, Daniel said. Thomas married you by proxy. Margaret stared at him in confusion. What does that mean? It means Thomas arranged for someone to stand in for you at a wedding ceremony here in Colorado. According to this document, you and Thomas were legally married 2 weeks before he died. Margaret felt dizzy. But I wasn't even here. How is that possible? Daniel explained that proxy marriages were sometimes used on the frontier when one person couldn't be present for the ceremony. Usually it required special permission from a judge. Thomas must have arranged this so you would have legal rights to his property if something happened to him, Daniel said. Margaret looked at the marriage certificate again. Her name was written there in official ink, along with Thomas's signature and the signature of a witness and a judge. This means the mine belongs to me? Margaret asked. According to the law, yes, Daniel said. You're Thomas's widow. You inherited everything he owned. They sat in silence for a moment, trying to understand what this meant. Margaret was now a wealthy woman. If she could keep the mine away from the men who had killed Thomas. Those men from the mining company don't know about this marriage certificate, Daniel said. They think Thomas died without any family. What should we do? Margaret asked. Daniel thought for a moment. We need to file this certificate with the territorial government immediately. Once it's on record, you'll have legal claim to the mine. Then we can use Thomas's written account to accuse those men of murder. But Margaret was thinking about something else. Daniel, if I'm really Thomas's widow, then I have the right to know exactly what happened to my husband. I want to confront these men myself. Daniel looked alarmed. That's too dangerous, Margaret. These men are killers. Maybe, Margaret said. But I'm not some helpless woman anymore. I'm the legal owner of a valuable silver mine. That gives me power. Margaret was scared, but she was also angry. These men had killed the man she was supposed to marry. They had tried to steal what belonged to her. It was time for them to pay for what they had done. We do this together, Daniel said firmly. I won't let you face those men alone. Margaret nodded. She was grateful to have Daniel as an ally. Together they would make sure Thomas got the justice he deserved. Daniel and Margaret spent the rest of the day making plans. They decided that Margaret should take the marriage certificate and Thomas's written account to the territorial courthouse in the larger town of Pine Ridge, about 50 miles away. There she could register her legal claim to Thomas's mine and report the murder to authorities who had more power than Sheriff Coleman. "I'll take you there myself," Daniel said. "It's too dangerous for you to travel alone." They packed the important papers carefully and hid the silver samples in a new location. Margaret felt nervous but determined. She was no longer just a poor woman with no choices. She was the legal owner of valuable property, and she had evidence that could put murderers in prison. The next morning, they told Mrs. Henderson that they would be away for a few days on family business. Mrs. Henderson agreed to let Margaret's work duties wait until she returned. As they were preparing to leave town, Sheriff Coleman approached them. "I heard you folks are taking a trip," he said. "Mind if I ask where you're going?" Daniel and Margaret had agreed not to tell anyone their real plans until they had filed the legal papers. "Just to Pine Ridge to settle some of Thomas's affairs," Daniel said. Sheriff Coleman nodded, but Margaret could see that he was suspicious. "Be careful on the road," he said. "There have been reports of bandits in the area." As they rode out of town, Margaret felt like they were being watched. She looked back several times but didn't see anyone following them. The trip to Pine Ridge normally took 2 days, but Daniel wanted to travel fast. They rode hard all day, stopping only to rest the horses and eat quick meals. By evening, they had covered almost half the distance. They made camp in a small grove of trees near a stream. Daniel built a small fire to cook their food, but he was careful to keep it hidden from the road. "Do you think those men know what we're doing?" Margaret asked as they ate. "I don't know," Daniel said, "but we can't take any chances. Once we file those papers tomorrow, you'll have legal protection. Until then, we're vulnerable." That night, Margaret had trouble sleeping. Every small noise made her think that someone was creeping up on their camp. But the night passed quietly, and they were on the road again before dawn. By noon the next day, they reached Pine Ridge. It was much larger than Millbrook, with several streets of businesses and even a small hotel. The courthouse was an impressive brick building in the center of town. Margaret felt nervous as they walked up the steps to the courthouse. This was the moment that would change everything. If the officials accepted her marriage certificate, she would become one of the wealthiest women in the territory. The clerk who helped them was a thin, serious man named Mr. Patterson. He examined the marriage certificate carefully. "This appears to be in order," he said finally. "But I have to ask, were you present at this ceremony, Mrs. Brennan?" Margaret felt strange being called Mrs. Brennan, but she answered honestly, "No, sir. It was a proxy marriage. I was traveling from Boston at the time." Mr. Patterson frowned. "Proxy marriages are unusual, but they are legal under territorial law if they're properly authorized." He looked at the judge's signature on the certificate. "Judge Morrison did sign this, and he has the authority to perform such ceremonies." The clerk filled out several forms and stamped them with official seals. "Congratulations, Mrs. Brennan. You are now the legal owner of your late husband's property, including his mining claim." Margaret felt a mixture of relief and sadness. She was now officially Thomas's widow, even though she had never met him. Next, they went to see the territorial sheriff, a big man named Sheriff Hayes. Daniel and Margaret showed him Thomas's written account of the threats he had received from the mining company. Sheriff Hayes read the papers carefully. "These are serious accusations," he said. "Murder and claim jumping are both hanging offenses. What can you do about it?" Daniel asked. "I'll send a telegram to the federal marshal in Denver," Sheriff Hayes said. "He has jurisdiction over crimes involving mining companies. In the meantime, I advise you to be very careful. If these men are as dangerous as your evidence suggests, they won't give up easily." As they left the sheriff's office, Margaret felt both hopeful and frightened. They had taken important steps to protect her legal rights and to seek justice for Thomas, but they had also made themselves targets. "We should stay in Pine Ridge tonight," Daniel suggested. "It's safer than camping on the road." They took rooms at the hotel. Margaret was grateful for a real bed and a hot meal after 2 days of hard travel, but even in the safety of the hotel, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were in danger. The next morning, they began the journey back to Millbrook. They had traveled about 10 miles when Daniel suddenly stopped his horse. "Someone's following us," he said quietly. Margaret looked back and saw 2 riders in the distance. They were too far away to identify, but they seemed to be keeping pace with Daniel and Margaret. "What should we do?" Margaret asked. Daniel thought for a moment. "There's an old mining camp about 5 miles ahead. If we can reach it, we might be able to hide until they pass by. They urged their horses to go faster. Margaret kept looking back at the two riders who seemed to be getting closer. Her heart was pounding with fear. The abandoned mining camp was just a few old buildings and some broken equipment. Daniel led them behind the largest building where their horses couldn't be seen from the road. They waited in tense silence for several minutes. Then they heard the sound of horses approaching. Margaret held her breath as the riders came closer. The horses stopped right near their hiding place. Margaret could hear voices, and her blood turned cold when she recognized them. They were the same two men she had overheard at Thomas's mine. They definitely came this way, the older man was saying. But where did they go? Maybe they turned off the road, the younger man said. We need to find them, the older man said angrily. If that woman files legal papers, we could lose everything. Margaret realized with horror that these men somehow knew about their trip to Pine Ridge. Had someone in town told them? Or had they been watching the courthouse? What if they've already filed the papers? The younger man asked. Then we'll have to take care of them permanently, the older man said in a cold voice, just like we took care of her husband. Margaret felt sick hearing them talk so casually about murder. Daniel's face was dark with rage, but he motioned for her to stay quiet. After what felt like hours, the two men rode away. Daniel and Margaret waited until they were sure the men were gone before coming out of hiding. They know we went to Pine Ridge, Margaret said. How is that possible? Daniel's jaw was tight with anger. Someone told them. Someone in Millbrook is working with these men. Margaret felt betrayed and frightened. If they couldn't trust people in Millbrook, where could they go? Who could they turn to for help? We can't go back to town yet, Daniel said. It's not safe. We need to find somewhere to hide until the federal marshal arrives. Where can we go? Margaret asked. Daniel thought for a moment. I know a place. There's an old cabin up in the mountains where I used to hunt with Thomas when we were boys. It's hard to find unless you know exactly where to look. They took a different route back toward Millbrook, staying off the main roads. Daniel led them up a narrow mountain trail that Margaret never would have found on her own. The cabin was small and rough, but it was well hidden among the trees. Daniel said it had been built by an old trapper who had died years ago. We should be safe here, Daniel said, at least until help arrives. As they settled into the cabin for the night, Margaret realized that her life had changed completely in just a few days. She had gone from being a poor working woman to being a wealthy widow to being a target for murderers. But she also realized something else. As frightened as she was, she felt stronger than she ever had before. She had evidence that could put evil men in prison. She had legal rights that couldn't be taken away. And she had Daniel beside her, someone she could trust completely. We're going to get through this, Daniel said, as if he could read her thoughts. Margaret looked at him in the firelight and felt something she hadn't expected. Despite all the danger and fear, she was beginning to care for Daniel in a way that had nothing to do with Thomas or duty or convenience. Yes, she said, we are. Daniel and Margaret spent 3 days hiding in the mountain cabin. During those days, they talked more than they ever had before. Margaret learned about Daniel's life working cattle drives and his regrets about fighting with Thomas. Daniel learned about Margaret's difficult childhood and her dreams for the future. On the third evening, they heard horses approaching the cabin. Daniel grabbed his rifle and told Margaret to hide in the back room. But when he looked out the window, he saw Sheriff Coleman and 2 other men he didn't recognize. Daniel Brennan, Sheriff Coleman called out. It's safe to come out. I have federal marshals with me. Daniel opened the door cautiously. Sheriff Coleman was there with 2 men wearing official badges. One was a tall man with a gray mustache, and the other was younger with serious dark eyes. I'm Marshal Williams, the older man said. This is Marshal Thompson. We received a telegram from Sheriff Hayes in Pine Ridge about your situation. Margaret came out of the back room, relieved to see friendly faces. How did you find us? She asked. I figured you might come here, Sheriff Coleman said. I remembered Thomas talking about this old cabin when you boys were young. Marshal Williams looked around the small cabin. We have some news for you. We've arrested the 2 men you identified, Robert Harrison and James Mitchell from the Rocky Mountain Mining Company. Margaret felt a surge of relief and excitement. You caught them. We found them at Thomas's mine, Marshal Thompson said. They were there with mining equipment, trying to work the claim illegally. When we confronted them with the evidence you provided, Harrison confessed to everything. Daniel stepped forward. He admitted to killing Thomas? He did, Marshal Williams said grimly. Apparently, they offered Thomas money for his claim several times. When he refused to sell, they decided to make it look like a mining accident. Harrison hit Thomas with a pickaxe and then caused the cave-in to hide the evidence. Margaret felt tears in her eyes. Finally, Thomas would have justice. The men who killed him would pay for their crime. What will happen to them? She asked. They'll be tried for murder, Marshal Williams said. With Harrison's confession and the evidence you provided, they'll almost certainly hang. Sheriff Coleman looked embarrassed. I owe you both an apology, he said. I should have investigated Thomas's death more carefully. I just assumed it was an accident because that's what usually happens in the mines. You couldn't have known, Daniel said. These men were very careful to make it look like an accident. Marshal Thompson had more news. We also investigated the Rocky Mountain Mining Company. It turns out they've been using these illegal tactics all over Colorado. Harrison and Mitchell were just two of many men they hired to intimidate small miners. The territorial government is shutting down the company, Marshal Williams added. Their assets are being seized to pay compensation to the families of miners they've cheated or killed. Margaret could hardly believe it. Not only would Thomas's killers be punished, but other families would get justice too. There's something else, Sheriff Coleman said. The territorial government wants to buy Thomas's mine from you, Mrs. Brennan. They're offering a very fair price, enough to make you wealthy for life. Margaret looked at Daniel. She had been thinking about this possibility. I don't want to keep the mine, she said. Too many bad things happened there, but I'd like to make sure the money goes to good use. Over the next few weeks, Margaret worked with the territorial government to sell the mine. The price was indeed enough to make her wealthy. But instead of keeping all the money for herself, she made several important decisions. First, she gave half the money to Daniel. Thomas would have wanted his brother to have part of this, she said. And you helped me get justice for him. Second, she donated a large amount to build a school in Millbrook. Thomas believed in education, she explained. He would have wanted children to have better opportunities. Third, she used some of the money to help other women who came west looking for new lives. She worked with Mrs. Henderson to expand the boarding house and provide safe places for women to stay while they established themselves. But the most important decision Margaret made was about her own future. One evening, as summer was turning to fall, Daniel asked Margaret to take a walk with him. They went to the cemetery where Thomas was buried. Margaret had visited the grave many times since the killers were caught. I've been thinking about something, Daniel said as they stood by Thomas's grave. I know this might sound strange, but I think Thomas would have wanted us to be happy. Margaret had been thinking the same thing. Over the weeks they had spent together, she had grown to care deeply for Daniel. He was different from Thomas, more serious and less gentle, but he was a good man with a kind heart. I've been thinking about that too, Margaret said softly. Daniel took her hand. I know you came here to marry Thomas, not me, and I know it might seem wrong to have feelings for my brother's intended wife, but Margaret, I think I'm falling in love with you. Margaret felt her heart beat faster. I have feelings for you too, Daniel, but I feel guilty about it sometimes. Thomas wrote to me once that he hoped marrying you would help him learn to love someone. Daniel said, he would have wanted both of us to find love even if it wasn't the way he planned. That winter, Daniel and Margaret were married in a simple ceremony in Millbrook. Margaret wore the same blue dress she had planned to wear when she met Thomas. She felt that Thomas would have approved. They used part of Margaret's money to buy a ranch outside of town. Daniel was good with cattle and horses, and Margaret learned to love the peaceful life of a ranch wife. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. They named their first son Thomas in honor of the man who had brought them together. Margaret kept Thomas's letters for the rest of her life. Sometimes she would read them to her children and tell them about their Uncle Thomas, who had been a good man with a kind heart. The story of the mail-order bride who solved her husband's murder became famous throughout Colorado. People said it proved that love could triumph over evil and that justice would always win in the end. But Margaret knew the real lesson of her story was simpler than that. Sometimes the most unexpected events can lead to the greatest happiness. She had come to Colorado expecting one kind of life and found something completely different, but ultimately much better. Years later, when Margaret was an old woman surrounded by children and grandchildren, people would ask her if she ever regretted answering Thomas's advertisement in the newspaper. Never, she would always say. That decision brought me to Daniel, and Daniel brought me home. The silver mine that had caused so much trouble was eventually worked out and abandoned. But the school that Margaret built with the money still stood, educating generations of children in the growing town of Millbrook. And in the cemetery on the hill, Thomas's grave was always decorated with fresh flowers. Margaret made sure of that until the day she died, grateful to the man she never met for giving her the chance at happiness she never expected to find.